Happy Monday to everybody.
Good morning.
We'll go ahead and get started. Robert, I don't know if you had to make any announcements prior to us.
Yeah, just a few housekeeping announcements. As you may have just heard, this meeting is being recorded. For our committee members, if you're not speaking, please be sure to mute yourself. And for any member of the public wishing to make a public comment today, please use the raise your hand feature or press *9 if you're participating telephonically. All right, would you like to go to a roll call or to the pledge?
We'll go to the pledge. So if everybody will please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, thank you. Robert, we'll go ahead with roll call.
Okay, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your presence. Director Bernasconi.
Here.
Director Burris.
Here.
Frericks. Absent. Gog.
Yes.
Lozano.
Here.
Middleton.
Here.
Stollard. Absent. Thomas. Absent. Vice Chair Kozlowski.
Here.
And Chair Saragosa.
Here.
We do
Yeah,
have
and I'll also just say we also have our chair, Chair Gore, also joining us this morning. So good morning, Bonnie.
Good morning. Thank you.
Robert, do we have any public communications this morning?
no public comment.
All right, so we'll jump right into our action items. And our first one is remote board and committee meetings relating back to the executive order and the newly passed Assembly Bill 361. And Lynette has this presentation for us this morning. Thank you, Lynette.
I think I'm going to take that, Chair Saragosa. That's
Gotcha.
okay.
Yep.
As you know, we have been meeting under these rules for remote meetings separate and apart from the former teleconferencing rules under the California Brown Act through the end of September pursuant to an executive order by the governor. The legislature adopted and the governor has signed AB 361 into law now. We've previously believed that that was going to require a resolution to be adopted by each one of the committees in the board of SACOG. There's been a lot of discussion about AB 361 and that it would appear under the current circumstances that there is an emergency order still in the state of California, and due to state and local guidance relating to social distancing, that we are able to continue to meet under the procedures that we have been following without the necessity for the adoption of a resolution. So with that being said, there's no action needed by the committee at this time. We will continue to assess it. We may be required to adopt resolutions in the future, but it's not necessary for your meeting today.
Thank you, Kirk. Any questions? All right, seeing none. Kirk, and the bill, is it through all of next year, or was there a time date on it, or a?
No, it's effective immediately. I don't recall, Chair Saragosa, whether there's a sunset date on it. I believe that there is. Yeah.
Yes,
Eric,
January 2024.
Great.
2024. Okay. Thank you. All right, so that's there's no more questions. Any public comments on this item?
No public comment.
Thank you, Robert.
Move to approve item number 1.
So there's no motion or resolution required at this time. We're able to just proceed with the rest of the agenda of the committee.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Kirk. So we'll go ahead and file item 1 then. And we'll move to item 2, which is approval of the minutes of the August 30th, 2021 committee meeting.
Okay, move to approve the minutes. Second.
All right, we have a first and a second. Any comments on the minutes? Robert, any public comments?
No public comment.
Okay, roll call vote, please.
All right, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Directors Bernasconi,
Yes.
Burris,
Yes.
Frericks, absent, Gog,
Yes.
Lozano,
Aye.
Middleton,
Aye.
Stollard, absent, Thomas, absent, Vice Chair Kozlowski,
Yes.
and Chair Saragosa.
Aye.
Motion carries.
All right, thank you. All right, moving right along, we'll move to item 3, which is authorize a request for proposals for pricing and incentive pilot research and design framework. And Ms. Bradbury has this request or this item for us this morning. Thank you, Sabrina.
Good morning, committee members. Sabrina Bradbury, SACOG staff. Last month, the board approved an amendment to add this grant-funded project to the overall work program. The item before you today is to request authorization to release a request for proposals and to delegate authority to the executive director to negotiate and execute a contract with the selected consultant. In case you missed last month's overview of the project, it's a partnership between SACOG, the San Diego Association of Governments, and the Southern California Association of Governments to jointly develop a common research design framework for pricing and incentive pilots in our respective regions. Given that transportation pricing is a broad topic with a lot of complexity, staff and partners see value in hiring a consultant or team that has expertise in planning and designing projects that focus on transportation pricing and incentives. And this work will advance a pricing pilot that will test the idea of coupling mileage fees with incentives for using other modes. And the results of the study will be useful in designing systems like a mobility wallet, where people could have all of their transportation options and the various costs for those options all in one place. Attachment A is a summary of the scope of work that SACOG and partners are refining to release in the request for proposals. The consultant will develop a research design framework that will be used by all partners, and it could be used for other public agencies as well to launch future pilots. We are particularly interested in exploring how pricing combined with incentives could influence travel behavior. And we also want to better understand the equity impacts associated with transportation fees. So the consultant would develop a research design where they would look at determining sample sizes for our various regions, establishing baseline travel information of participants of a pilot, and looking at what privacy protections need to be in place to protect personally identifiable information. They would also develop a technology design where they would look at what types of devices would be needed and technological capabilities, and participant information and interface design, looking at how the information should be displayed to participants, what would the recruitment of pilot participants look like, and what sort of technical assistance like a help desk would be provided to participants. So this framework will allow us to test one of our hypotheses that if people are presented with current information about what they pay for travel and driving in particular, and then what their options are for avoiding those costs and receiving incentives for using other modes of travel, that people would be more responsive to incentives that change their travel in positive ways. So as we continue to coordinate with the state on a changeover from the gas tax to a road user charge, we know there's still a lot we want to learn about the impacts of fees like this at the local level, particularly, as I said, around equity and travel behavior. So we'll be coming back to you throughout the project to discuss milestones and progress. And we'll also be coming back to you to discuss pricing in various ways as we move through updating our Metropolitan Transportation Plan Sustainable Community Strategy. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Sabrina. Vice Chair Kozlowski.
Yes, thank you very much. My question is,
I don't know, maybe you've kind of answered it already, but given the scope of work that's described for a consultant to do, it seems like some or all of that might be within the capability of the 3 sets of staff. And I'm wondering what wisdom from outside we're expecting to receive on these, these particular topics.
Yeah, great question. The technology piece in particular, I think, is a big one where we're looking to see what technologies are out there. And we did a similar project on a research design for our household travel survey with the other big 3 MPOs. And it's just helpful to have outside assistance on thinking through what are all of the ways that we could set up the pilot to really answer the questions that we might have. And some of it too is just internal lack of staff resources to be able to work on the project. So while we do have some expertise here, we think that hiring an outside consultant would add to that knowledge base, because there are consultants and technology firms that work in this space. And we're hoping to get some partnership team that brings in both the technology side and the more research design piece of it.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Sabrina, I have a question in regards to on the equity side. I mean, there's always been this argument, if you will, on VMT in terms of it disproportionately affecting, BIPOC communities. And so I'm just wondering, will any of that, are we looking at some of that when we say equity in terms of as this transition is happening? I'm just wondering if that's a portion of what the consultant would be looking at.
Yes, absolutely. And there is some research that's already been done here where low-income communities in particular, which also tend to be BIPOC communities as well, that they're actually overpaying with their fair share with the gas tax because they often drive less fuel-efficient vehicles. So we'll be taking a deeper dive on that and also thinking through, should there be additional subsidies or incentives for people who don't have other travel options available to them? So what are the impacts to rural communities as well as BIPOC and low-income communities?
Okay, great, thank you. It's always kind of a chicken and egg thing to some degree as well. I mean, the infrastructure, there's plenty of people in the Valley I know that I work with that love to switch to a more efficient vehicle or even to electric, but the lack of infrastructure and the cost as well when it goes along with it. But you start somewhere, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I muted myself. Any other questions? Do we have any public comments? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was.
Go ahead, Tom.
Sometimes we have to figure out too how to charge electric vehicles when you live in an apartment building. That's not as easy as your own garage or carport. But my question was, where's the source of funding to finance this study?
Yes, this is going to be funded by a Caltrans Sustainable Communities Planning Grant that we were awarded in this last round.
You probably said that. I'm sorry, I missed it. Thank you.
No, you didn't miss it. It was an action from last round. So apologies, I did not highlight that again.
Well, I'm always happy to know where the money's coming from, because this is a discretionary activity on our part, but it sounds like it's a good one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure, Sir Grayson, do you mind if I
Yep, absolutely. Go ahead, James.
just to make up and Director Stollard, you prompted me there by saying discretionary. What this study is intended to do, which is to set up a pilot program, I think is absolutely critical. If you remember, those of you who were here in 2019 to adopt the last MTP-SCS, our long range plan, we actually put in a fee, a VMT fee, and we looked at actually congestion charging sort of price that varies by time of day. Like most utilities, like most private sector companies now actually price things, right, based on demand. And what we found in the MTP SES, and you adopted that in there, and Sabrina's done some really good presentations for board lunches to remind everybody, is it's going to be absolutely critical as we transition from the gas tax in the next 10 to 15 years to think about what comes next, but to think about what comes next from also from a demand management point of view. So for example, the person who jumps on Highway 50 on a Monday morning at 9 a.m. and Highway 50 completely kind of breaks down, that's a very expensive trip. Is there a way that we can use in the future of pricing, demand management to actually discourage that? And that this is not an easy topic because it talks, you know, we're going to talk about how much do we charge people for using the transportation network. But the flip side of it, which I don't think gets covered enough, and we think it has a huge benefit in this region, a huge potential, is could we also look at, as Sabrina has said, providing incentives? What's the other side of that to actually incentivize consumer behavior and driver behavior to go into van pools, carpools, telework, ride your bike one day when the air quality is not very good, right? So this is a multi-step process, but we believe it's going to be critical to implement the MTP SES. It's going to be critical to actually having a transportation system in this region in the future that can actually manage demand, generate revenue, and it's what comes next after the gas tax. So we're excited we got this. It took us a few times going to Caltrans to get this grant award, and the partnership with our partner agencies I think is also great. So expect that this committee will be engaged in this work because it's a big deal.
Thank you, James. Okay, Robert, do we have any public comments on this item?
No public comment.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if there's no further discussion, I'll entertain a motion.
I'll move the action.
Approval.
Second.
All right, I got, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Tom. All right, we have a first and a second. Roll call vote, please.
Okay, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bernasconi. Just having technical issues at the moment.
Aye, yes, thank you.
Perfect. And Director Burris? Absent. Frericks? Absent. Director Gog?
Yes.
Lozano?
Aye.
Middleton?
Aye.
Stollard?
Aye.
Thomas? Absent. Vice Chair Kozlowski?
Yes.
And Chair Saragosa.
Yes.
Motion carries.
All right, thank you, Robert. Okay, moving along, we will move to item 4, and that's adoption of the final draft for public participation plan. And Ms. Ramos has this presentation this morning. Thank you, Rosie.
Good morning, everyone. Rosie Ramos here, Project Manager for the Public Participation Plan update. I am back today to bring you the final draft and asking for your recommendation to our board to adopt this final version. Since I was last here in June, we have completed a 45-day public comment period from June 17th to August 9th. We made changes and some edits and had a legal review of our document. I will do a high-level overview of what those changes were, but I did want to just do a quick refresher on what the public participation plan is in general. So just a quick reminder, all MPOs, Metropolitan Planning Organizations like SACOG, are required to maintain a plan that guides our outreach processes for projects and programs with a specific call out for the MTP SES, our long range plan, the Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program, or the MTIP, and the overall work program, or the OWP. The final draft PPP will be used as a reference point for the development of the MTP SES outreach that we will do in the fall of 2022. This document, the PPP, it helps our SACOG staff understand the minimum requirements for public communications and outreach, but it also gives documentation for the public to see where and how they can plug into the work and what they can expect from us. And it's a process document that supports staff as we develop those specific plans for each project. So I think Director Kozlowski said it best in the first meeting that I was here, that it's a plan for a plan, essentially. So I will pause there before I get into the specific, if there's any questions on overview of the PPP. Okay. So in the final draft that you have before you, we focused on giving readers background on what SACOG is and what we do. We include the committees that we have, provide background on why we have to do the PPP, and most importantly, we explain the federal and state requirements that we have to meet. So this plan includes a guide for staff and as to how to develop a public participation process with different strategies, including best practices for reaching our Black, Indigenous, and people of color or BIPOC communities and our low-income residents. In terms of what has changed from the draft that you saw in June to now, there are no major changes since most of the edits were to clarify the language and make the document easier to read. Some of the specifics, though, include reference to the Brown Act. We made some edits to the MTP, SCS, and the MTIP areas where we moved some sections around for better flow, added language around a Federal Transit Administration requirement for agencies to publish a program of projects. And then the other section where we really made some changes was the Native American and tribal governments area. Again, it was mostly clarifying language just to be clear on what our intent was in that section. We did add to the list of tribes near our region that could have interest in the work that we do. And we also called out some specifics for AB 52, and as well as added language that referenced the Office of the Tribal Advisor from the state. And this was thanks to a really great comment that linked us to those resources from the state. So those were the major changes. You can see the comments as well as an attachment in your packet. But in general, just to recap, we drafted the PPP in May. We released a draft 45-day public comment period from June 17th to August 9th. We received 3 official comments and review from our FHWA liaison, which was really helpful. And then after the comment period, we revised, we edited, we wanted to make it clear and concise as much as possible. We had our legal team review it. And this is the product of that work. We have the final draft PPP for you. So I will stop there. I know that was high level, but if you have any specific questions, I'm happy to take them.
All right. Thank you, Rosie. Any questions?
I have one, Chair.
Yep.
So at one, and this is probably just a parsing words question. It probably doesn't warrant any kind of change, but at one point we describe as sort of best practices connecting with community-based organizations first, and then we identify them as who are trusted within the community. That feels a little squishy to me in terms of, you know, how wide of a community do they need to be trusted within, since we live in this post-truth era. And I'm just wondering if we aren't setting ourselves up for groups that are both community-based and trusted by some part of the community to demand representation as we go forward with different tasks.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's more of a rhetorical question or a philosophical one, but it just feels like we may have set ourselves up for something.
I think that's a good point. I think the intent behind that comment, right, is to make sure that we are working with that middle ground person or organizations, but I definitely hear what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, we don't always want to, you know, single out majority views either. However, we could end up with a distinctly minority view with an outsized set of input potentially. I guess that's just a problem with our world today. But anyway, like I said, I don't think it merits any kind of change to the language, because I think the language is, you know, the intent is fairly clear to a reasonable person, but just FYI.
Yeah, and I think that's a strategy that's coupled with everything else, right? That it's not going to be the only thing that we do, but I definitely, again, this is that groundwork. So giving this comment, I think that is really helpful as we go forward with additional specific plans to consider that while we do want to reach out to CBOs, that we are including as many voices as possible and not getting too squishy, as you mentioned there.
Right. Thank you.
Maybe I can address that too through the chair. So
course,
just
yep.
a follow-up item on that. So the public participation plan is this federal requirement that kind of I think sets out some specific groups, and it's everything from freight providers to marine transportation to public transportation providers and public transportation users. And one of the things that I think we can promise that we will do is bring this back for a refresh if we see that the groups that are reaching out to SACOG maybe are not well represented, or there's other things we need to change. Part of what's baked into the public participation plan is that we review it and revisit it if it's not doing a good job of reaching the public. And so I think if we see people trying to use it for other purposes, we can always bring that back to the board and say, hey, maybe we just need to tweak it. And so the flexibility is built in there as well, that we'll bring it back if we think it's not working the way that it was intended.
Thank you,
Thank you, Eric. I just had in terms of the Native American outreach, I know this is always sort of a tricky, I know, not that we struggle with it in Placerville, but you put the information out and sometimes you won't hear anything, or you'll just get maybe a letter that says, well, we don't have any interest. I mean, is that, do we sort of fulfill our responsibilities from a federal perspective, or is it more, do we have to do more beyond just sort of ensuring that people are informed, at least within the Native American aspect?
That's a really great point. And I think that's totally fair, because that is sometimes the case, right? You put out information and you don't, I mean, we only got 3 comments for our public participation plan. So that's sort of similar. But I think in terms of the tribal affairs, yes, what's included is that baseline minimum essentially of like what is technically required from the federal and state requirements. But what we did add based on this really good comment that I think was really helpful to me as well, was that there is actually a really great resource at the state for tribal engagement. It's the Office of Tribal Advisor. And so there's been a lot of, I spent a lot of time on that website and added some language there that, well, yes, the minimum is that we do send out that information and we wait to get responses. There is also the best practices aspect of the document that we have on there, right? That list that adds to that minimum, because we do want to meet the letter of the law, but we also want to make sure that we're doing the best that we can. So while we do have the minimum requirements that they're in place, the best practices strategies augment that.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, any other comments, questions? Okay, Robert, any public comments?
No public comment.
Okay, thank you. All right, then I'll bring it back to the board. If somebody wants to make
Move approval.
Thank you, Portia. Thank you, Director Gog. All right, with that, roll call, please.
Directors, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bernasconi.
Yes.
Burris. Let's see, Director Burris is on, but having technical issues.
She did say yes in the.
Perfect. I do see it in the chat.
Yep.
Let the record show that Burris says yes. Frericks, absent. Gog.
Yes.
Lozano.
Aye.
Middleton.
Aye.
Stollard.
Aye.
Thomas. Absent. Vice Chair Kozlowski.
Yes.
And Chair Saragosa.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Okay, thank you, Robert. All right, moving along to item 5. This is to approve amendment number 2 to the budget and OWP for fiscal year 2021-22. And Loretta has this presentation this morning. Thank you, Ms. Sue.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Loretta Sue, Finance Director. The board adopted the budget and OWP for fiscal year 2021-22 on May 20th, 2021. Throughout the year, staff bring back amendments to the budget and OWP to modify projects, add revenues, or adjust staff hours and expenditure between OWP, work elements, and operating activities. The purpose of this amendment number 2 to the budget and OWP is mainly to true up the carryover amounts for formula funds and discretionary grants, and then also adjust the indirect costs and fringe benefit rates to reflect the rate that was submitted to the FTA. And also included is the reallocate staff hour between projects to reflect the actual workload or anticipated employee utilizations. The operation budgets reflect an increase in revenue and expenditures of approximately $525,000 or 1.9% comparing to the amendment number 1 that was approved by the board in September. The increase is due to the federal formula funds of approximately $169,000, increase in the REAP carryover amount of $373,000, also included various increase on multi-year grants carryover and other funds of $240,000. And then offset it by a decrease in the projected TVA carryover amount of $240,000. The attachment A shows the changes in the overall revenue by funding source comparing to the adopted and the amendment number 1. Attachment B's to E provide a summary of revenue and expenditures included in the amendment number 2 to the fiscal year 21-22 budget and OWP. And then attachment F is an updated indirect cost included as part of the fiscal year 2021-22 budget and also reflect what was submitted to the FTA for review and approval. The board and advocacy budget also have a slight increase of approximately $16,000. This is due to an adjustment to interest income anticipated for the current fiscal year. Attachment H is the amendment number 2 to the board and advocacy budgets for the year. With this amendment, the SACOG budget and OWP for fiscal year 2021-22 reflects an overall total revenue of $29.5 million, an increase of $541,000. With that, staff is recommending the board approve amendment number 2 to the budget and OWP for fiscal year 2021-22 and authorize staff to submit all required documents to Caltrans and federal funding agency. With that, I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions related to this amendment.
Looks like we're good. I guess don't think any questions. Was that, did you, anything else?
Sorry, yeah, nothing else. So if there's no
Okay.
questions, yeah, staff is recommending the Policy and Innovation Committees to recommend the board to approve this budget amendment.
All right, thank you, Loretta. Okay, any other, when we put it out there, but any questions or comments on the budget amendment? See none. Robert, any public comment?
No public comment.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, move approval of the item.
Thank you, Director Stoller.
Second.
Thank you, Director Lozano. First and a second, let's go ahead to roll call, please.
Okay, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bernasconi.
Yes.
Burris. I see in the chat that Burris has said yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Director Frericks. Absent. Gog.
Yes.
Lozano.
Aye.
Middleton.
Aye.
Stollard.
Aye.
Thomas. Absent. Vice Chair Kozlowski
Yes.
and Chair Sargosa.
Yes.
Motion carries.
All right. Thank you, Robert. Okay, moving along well here. So we'll move on to our information items this morning and item 6, which is our advocacy update. So welcome back to Sabrina for our state and federal update.
Hello again. Thank you. We have one of our federal lobbyists here, so I'm going to turn it over to Devin Barnhart for the federal update, and then I will give the state update. Devin, you want to take it from here?
Hi all.
Good afternoon, Devin.
Hello. I'm going to stop my video as per usual, just in case we have any challenges here.
No
Share my screen 1 second. Here we go. Okay, that should be working. So quickly, I'm going to run through sort of where things stand in the world. Last time we all talked, I let you all know that September is a nightmare month in Congress because there are hundreds and hundreds of things that needed to get done this month, not the least of which was the giant infrastructure package, as well as reconciliation, debt ceiling, funding the federal government. It's just been a host of sort of big picture issues that would usually take up all of Congress's energy happening all at once. So it's been a little bit of a crazy month. But I'm just going to run through where we stood and then where things are and hopefully a little bit about where we're going. You know us. These are the 2 big bills that we're tracking. Social infrastructure is that big giant piece that is causing the holdup right now. The hard infrastructure bill is the more traditional infrastructure that we are all familiar with. This is the same slide you guys have seen before, but that traditional infrastructure is all the things we care about, including the policy in our space around MPOs, highways, transit, rail, et cetera. The infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bill continue to be politically linked. And this is a very charged issue right now. This is what all the newspaper articles are getting written about. I could go into the minutia, but I will just tell you this, is that there's the left flank in Congress of the Democrats that really want to see the big reconciliation bill get done. They're the moderates that care about reconciliation sometimes, but not really. They're really focused on infrastructure. They want that to be done now, and they're fighting. And we can't get the bill passed unless all the Democrats are on the same page, because reconciliation is a Democrat-only bill. And so we got to get the Democrats all in line in order for both of these to move forward. Last Friday, it looked like infrastructure is maybe going to move forward on its own. They were going to reach some sort of overarching deal on reconciliation, and that infrastructure could pass and become law. However, after multiple rounds of negotiation, including the president going over to Congress, which is not a very frequent activity, the president came out and said, we need to pass both of these together. So he basically sided with the progressives. And over the weekend, we heard a lot of angst from the moderates, being pretty upset that the bills continue to be linked. But what that means, big picture, is that we're still in a little bit of a stalemate, which is where we are. We're like stuck in traffic on all of these bills, and we will be through the month of October. Just as a reminder, these bills, especially the infrastructure bill, is a big deal to all of us. And so a lot of the priorities we care about, it's a big plus up of funding for highways, transit, and then a huge plus up in rail that we don't normally see. California sees similar increases, and so it's important to the state, and it will help add on to that host of funding that's already gone out the door for COVID purposes. This is much longer term money. It can be spent over the course of 5 years. Reconciliation is that even though we're fighting over that bill, it does have a little bit of transportation money and housing money that we just want to highlight for you. The last time we talked, I think they had just started to get their ducks in a row on what that funding was going to look like. There's still a lot of question marks about whether it stays at 3.5 trillion, whether it gets smaller, but there's a couple of programs that the House has passed that the House wants to be included that are important to note. So most particularly, there's $10 billion for housing and transit. This is really a transit program. It says housing and transit, and it links housing and transit and encourages more overlap, but really it's a way to try and get 10 additional $1 billion for transit. Hard to get additional billion out, because a lot of folks on the Democratic side think that that was lost in the bipartisan deal. They wanted that transit number to be $10 billion higher. And so they're trying to find a way to plug it back into reconciliation. It's tied to housing because they're trying to avoid anyone saying that they're double dipping, that like we've already done this issue in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. But really, it's a really pretty broadly written transit program. The second one is the climate program. This is really useful to us. There's $3 billion that can go out to non-state entities. A lot of the priorities around Green Means Go, but other locally driven priorities can be incorporated in this bill as long as they're tied to GHG reductions. And so this is an important one that we've been tracking. Unlocking Possibilities is a new program, and the title's kind of odd, like it doesn't really tell you what it is, but it's essentially a housing and planning program. It is planning grants that help improve housing and urban development strategies and implement livable communities. We've all seen the benefits of livable communities under the Obama administration, where they tried to better tie together land use, housing, and transportation. This is a big continuation of that. It would be housed within HUD, but have a lot of overlap with the transportation, with the Department of Transportation. And then the last big program to keep an eye on, there it is the Community Restoration Program. This is planning and implementation grants. So there's a bunch of money in here for actual projects on the ground that are community-led projects to stabilize neighborhoods and increase access to opportunity through equitable infrastructure and affordable housing. It's a lot of our favorite type of programs that people have been talking about in terms of trying to add equity into infrastructure. It's also a HUD program, but there's a lot of eligibility for regional entities in this program. And so that $8 billion is a huge program in terms of what HUD has been able to fund in this space previously. So while none of these programs are set in stone, all of the bullets on the left-hand side still hold true. The size of the bill is up in the air, the substance is still sort of up in the air, and the votes are certainly up in the air, but these were all House passed. And so when the Senate takes up the bill, we're fighting to keep these 4 priorities, others as well, but these are the main core 4 that we're fighting to keep in because they can really help fund regional activities that SACOG and others are focused on. And is Jason on? I think Jason was gonna.
Yep, sorry about that.
No worries. Kicking it over to you, buddy.
Yeah, perfect. So, effectively where we are is gridlock in many ways. I think there's a handful of things to look at in terms of how they're all separate issues, but are all jointly related. As Devin alluded to, we're in the middle of reconciliation. There is effectively an inter-Democratic party disagreement over size, scope, what should be in, what shouldn't be in. And effectively, progressive Democrats are holding the infrastructure package, the bipartisan infrastructure package, hostage until there is an agreement on the reconciliation bill and a path forward. You effectively have progressive Democrats, roughly 60 to 90 of them in the House, to varying degrees, saying that a clear path forward on reconciliation / passage must be agreed upon before they vote for the bipartisan infrastructure package. I think leading up until last Thursday evening, I think that we probably got within 5 votes needed to pass the bipartisan infrastructure package. The question that is largely vexing everyone is, what does an agreement to move forward mean? Does it mean a mutually sort of agreed upon set of principles of what should be in the bipartisan infrastructure, or the reconciliation package? Right now, Manchin and Sinema highlighted here are saying no more than $1.5 trillion in terms of spending, and then certain things that are sort of off limits related to corporate tax rates and things of that nature. And progressives are looking at a larger bill, $3.5 trillion. So there's a bunch of these parts in play. From our perspective, related to the bipartisan infrastructure package, which has cleared the Senate, is awaiting the House. The next sort of deadline, the next sort of key date to look at is October 31st. That is when the FAST Act was extended to. If there is no action or no agreement to move forward on either reconciliation or the bipartisan infrastructure bill, then that will get kicked further out. Reconciliation, there is no timeline, as President Biden alluded to over the weekend, that he's basically saying, any timelines we have for reconciliation are mostly self-inflicted, which is true. However, recognizing that other parts of the broader agenda do have deadlines, like the bipartisan infrastructure bill, because of the FAST Act needing to be extended. So that, again, as we say here, it is clear until October 31st. The next sort of major headache that I think will leapfrog over bipartisan infrastructure bill and reconciliation is the debt ceiling. Effectively, the debt ceiling is our ability to borrow money, and it limits that. It's sort of a credit card max out limit, and projected to be October 18th. The credit card will expire or will be tapped out, and unless Congress votes to increase the limit or eliminate the debt ceiling itself, we will begin to default on payments, on loan payments, bond payments, things of that nature, which will create catastrophe within not only our economy, but in theory worldwide. So that is sort of a real deadline that is coming up, that is a moving deadline. Someone asked me earlier today why Federal Highways is sort of freezing payments as a part of the extension, the FAST Act extension. They basically said no new money would be released until October 15th. Well, part of the reason why is they want to make sure that there's money in the Treasury for the ahead of the debt ceiling. So not releasing federal highway funds for 15 days gives the Treasury effectively a few $1 billion to play with, which sounds like a lot, but is really sort of pennies considering. But that's the extraordinary measures that are taking place. What Congress was able to do last week was to continue to fund the government without a government shutdown. There was a continuing resolution passed that will fund the government through December 5th, I believe is the date. That's a very important point in time. Often when we get into this time of year, we have a lot of these major issues sort of coming up and bubbling up. And what we often see is sort of short-term, kick the can down the road until middle of December. And nothing motivates Congress quite like the possibility of having to spend the holidays in session versus back at home or with their families. So I think we're beginning to see, I think what I believe will be a pinnacle, which is on October 31st. If there is no agreement to move an infrastructure bill forward, the next sensible day to see all of those bills extended to would be into mid-December. It would not surprise me to see the debt limit increased, this month, only enough so that it would be extended for a few months. However, that's all. It's all up to be debated. But effectively, this is where we're at. I have a meme that I use in the background quite often for these calls where it's a popular meme with Elmo and his hands up and there's fire in the background. That is effectively what we're dealing with right now. The one thing I will say is that Speaker Pelosi has been in this situation before and has often pulled us out of, I think, this sort of mess. And it's a time of crisis where Minority Leader McConnell and Majority Leader Schumer have found a way to work together. But unfortunately, it sort of takes this level of crisis. But that's sort of where we are. Devin, I think next slide. Sort of a little bit more regionally, our focus has largely been moved on a little bit from the infrastructure package, because as Devin alluded to, the bipartisan infrastructure package is in a box, all the wrapping papers on it. It's under the proverbial Christmas tree. It will not change. It is what it is, and it's a matter of, in many cases, when, and maybe a little bit if, but really when that package will become law. But what is still being talked about and still being worked on is the reconciliation bill and some of the areas that that we care about collectively are being considered as a part of that package. There's a lot of focus in the legislation on housing, transportation, and land use. And what we are really working very hard on is making sure that the details of those programs match up with eligibilities, processes, things that Green Means Go would like to accomplish. And a lot of times that's very specific changes that we're seeking. And to date, we've gotten great cooperation from a number of other metropolitan planning organizations from around the country that we've been talking to that are in similar situations, and then have reached out, worked with them, and sent lists of recommendations to our Senate colleagues, both Senator Padilla, Senator Feinstein, but also other senators, as well as the leadership offices that are writing this reconciliation package. So we're dealing with both the details of the language, the minutia of it, but at the same time working to ensure that that funding is included. And it's roughly about $15 billion in funding that is geared towards supporting transit-oriented development, land use, housing, et cetera. So we've worked very hard this month, not only to organize those MPOs, but also to get the bullet points and the details right. And I think we've gotten firm commitments from Senate negotiators and House negotiators writing these packages to address our concerns, either by changing the legislative language itself, or once the legislation becomes law, working with us to work with the different agencies to ensure that what we want to do with the funding can be done with the funds once they're released. Devin, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that point.
Yeah, I just would say that the importance of this coalition, and SACOG is really leading the charge here with these folks. It's an issue of interest that folks are feeling across the country, but SACOG's really been driving this message and sort of adding more and more MPOs. We had 13 MPOs on this letter, but adding more MPOs as we go along who are really interested in these topics. And so that support is really important as we look at reconciliation in the Senate, and we're pushing on those senators. It also happens to be a broad spectrum of senators. A lot of folks are in leadership, and a lot of folks are in key states that can be really helpful politically. And then, but also long term, it's a really great group, and I'm glad that SACOG is leading the charge here, because we can also use that as we look towards the administration and implementation of these programs once the bills are passed. So you'll hear more about this group as we move forward. And then one last point, I know all of this is sort of clear as mud, right? Like the bills keep going back and forth. They all get blurred together in the press, but the takeaway is we're working through a slog, and the end part is always the worst part. And we are certainly in a pretty dark, bad, hopefully this is the worst part. Hopefully we are in the midst of that final piece that takes a lot of fighting in the press. And so don't read too much into what you see. We will keep everyone informed if we think things are going south, but we're just in the hard negotiating part right now. And then the thing for you guys to keep in your mind date wise is the end of the month is the next big deadline that we will be watching. So probably around the Halloween mark, we will have some sense, or a little bit before, some sense of where things are headed and whether we're going to see these bills move forward or whether we'll see a further extension of the programs.
Our own personal hope is that the slides for the next legislative committee meeting are due the same day that all these decisions are being made, so we can have 45 different versions of slide decks to send to you guys the day of.
Hopefully it's just filled with dollar signs.
Right.
Any questions on any of that?
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Devin, for the presentation. It's good to know that what we all are kind of seeing here on the West Coast is exactly the Elmo meme is sort of exactly what we're all been reading in the papers and seeing on TV throughout this time. I have a question. I mean, would it be fair to state that, while there's still the huge discussion regarding the 3.5 and what, trillion or an S after that, where that ends ultimately, but that the hard infrastructure package is, we kind of have an idea of what's there versus, it's a great unknown in the 3.5, but that what we're looking at is more encapsulated in the hard infrastructure bill, or is there still a ton of it in the other bill as well?
The hard infrastructure bill is all but set in stone. It is, no one really, occasionally someone hints at a rumor about touching that bill and everyone loses their mind. So it's very much set in stone because it was passed with bipartisan support. You would have to go back to the Senate and get all of that bipartisan support. It would be truly a nightmare to do. So nearly set in stone with like knocking on all the wood. And there is a whole host of funding that is very helpful to us in those programs. The reconciliation bill, much more in flux, also good money and potentially really good programs in there, but it's the bulk of what we're looking at is in that bipartisan infrastructure piece.
Thank you.
Here, sir, just can I
Yes.
make a quick comment on this? It's always important, right, that we're and as you can tell from Devin and Jason, we're engaged in this. It's been great to be leading this coalition of other regions around the country on this, but in particular, and even just as a setup for maybe questions from board members, many of you, right, are either going back in person to DC later this month on the Placer Business Alliance trip, or we have a virtual cap-to-cap Metro Chamber trip that we'll be doing virtually. And so even for people who follow the federal stuff all the time, this is a very complicated place we find ourselves in. But Devin and Jason reinforce this or say, if I'm wrong here, it's really important though that you understand enough of these big picture details to be able to engage, ask the questions, right? Because it is so complicated, but I think that those trips will be more beneficial. If you have a sense of what's happening with the infrastructure bill, with reconciliation, and we can certainly do this offline as well, but I will note, we've got a lot of engagement going on in this month. Good timing, by the way. Whoever thought up the October trips was a genius. But those questions are going to be really important. And if we can help any of you, and we'll certainly talk to Placer Business Alliance, and we're engaged in the Metro Chamber trip as well. This is a great time to be in front of all of our folks back in DC and the committee staff and the administration. So just, I want to, if think of questions also in that light as well, maybe helping you sharpen your questions for these trips and later this month.
I would just add to James, I think somebody asked us to verify that. I would say the best example is there's a lot of noise, but you got to put headphones on, you hear exactly what we need to be heard. And truth be told, to James's point, there's a lot of chaos. This is just an infrastructure, and reconciliation is 45 other issues, many of which are core to why people run for Congress, right? Childcare, healthcare, that's a suggested infrastructure. It isn't important, but most members of Congress don't run for Congress because they want to build bridges and buy buses. So I think there's very specific things that we can help you guys hone in on, those who would like to, sort of, at a time and point. And I simply say, I think things change on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis here. So as those trips come, if we can be of use, we can let you know exactly, what we're telling offices and what we're saying to people, and you can, help, if you so choose, echo those sentiments to some of those critical members. I think we could probably put bullets together now, but it would probably be more useful 10 days from now, when I'm sure the world will look completely different than it does today.
And just one other note, that folks in Congress are exasperated. If any of us are feeling that way, they're feeling it tenfold, just because they've been doing really late nights on these votes. They've been doing tons of negotiations, all to not see either of the bills move forward. So you might hear a lot of frustration in your meetings. It doesn't mean that people aren't very supportive of the pieces that are in this bill, but the process has been really draining on folks. And so you might hear some angst when you're talking to people about these bills, but it still isn't indicative of whether or not they're going to pass. It's just part of the process. And this has been, in addition to being really complicated, it's been a really long and frustrating process for them.
Thank you. And James, thanks for that as well. I mean, you're right. Essentially, we have an extra 30 days of lobbying, if you will, that weren't otherwise going to be there. And so, whether it's on trips like the Placer one, or virtual, or just communicating individually with your representative or senator, I think it is important that we engage and that they hear from us as local leaders about budget priorities that we have, both individually from our cities as well as for our region for SACOG. So I think it's a great underlining to do so that we can engage as they're going into further discussions that are going to last throughout October now. Questions or comments from board members for Devin or for Jason? All right, seeing none, then I'm going to go ahead. Jason, Devin, thank you very much for the update. We'll be in touch, I'm sure, especially if we have members that will need maybe some specific talking points as they reach out to our congressional delegation. And with that, we'll move on to our state update.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to share my screen here. Can you all see that? All right.
Yes.
So I'm going to cover an update on the bills in which SACOG took a position. Session ended on September 10th, so I'll let you know where we're at on those. And then I also want to discuss some budget bills that went through, funding for Green Means Go and housing, transportation funding, and some economic development and broadband funding. So attachment A shows the status of the bills that SACOG took a position on, and 7 of the bills SACOG supported were sent to the governor. 2 of those have been signed already. One was AB 361, shown on this slide, and mentioned by Kirk at the top of the meeting, so I think you're familiar with that one. And the other was SB 10, which gives flexibility to local governments by providing a streamlined path for rezoning infill areas with up to 10 units of residential density if the parcel is located in transit-rich area or an urban infill site. And that is up to just gives some flexibility to jurisdictions if they choose to do that. And the other bills, we will keep you posted. The governor has until October 10th to sign or veto legislation. So we will let you know what happens with those remaining that are shown in green here, but have not yet been signed into law. On Green Means Go, we secured $38 million for the SACOG region. There was $34 million from a statewide program that was modeled off of Green Means Go called REAP 2.0. And then we also secured another $4 million from SB 170, a budget bill that at the time of the writing of the item had not been signed, but it now has been signed by the governor. And there's opportunity for more funding through a $30 million competitive pot that's also part of that REAP 2.0 program. So for the state funds that are part of that overall statewide program, some of those will become available as soon as January. We're actively tracking the development of guidelines for those, and we'll be weighing in on the competitive pot in particular to make sure it lines up with what we want to achieve with our Green Means Go program, and that we would be competitive there. And I do want to note that while it's not the $100 million that we were seeking, it can't be understated that our efforts resulted in this statewide program that is $600 million statewide, and that we were able to snag an additional $4 million specific for Green Means Go to our region that will come from Strategic Growth Council, and we anticipate to have that funding soon. We're continuing to look for opportunities at the federal level, as Devin and Jason mentioned, in this year, and then we'll be discussing our approach for next state legislative advocacy efforts and what we do to continue to advance this work. And then on other housing programs, there are some listed here on this slide that are aimed at getting more housing in the state, particularly to address affordable housing and homelessness. But I wanted to call out the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program, $250 million pot there for statewide projects. And these funds could complement our Green Means Go efforts. And we'll be reaching out to all of your member staff to ensure that they know about this funding and provide any assistance that they might need in competing for those funds. On transportation funding, I'm sure most of you have probably heard the disappointing news that the legislature and the governor were not able to reach agreement on how to spend $4.2 million in high-speed rail funding. And so there was a $3.4 million that reverted back to the general fund that were going to be one-time transportation funds. But I wanted to call out that this does not mean that there's no transportation funding. We still have SB1 funds. The additional funding that's made available through SB1 will remain untouched, and all normal transportation revenues will be distributed as expected from that program. And then there is $2 billion for state highway rehabilitation, local roads and bridges that is still part of the budget, and some electric vehicle infrastructure programs that were proposed by the governor in his original budget proposal for electric vehicle infrastructure. And those will all move forward as planned. And then we will be working on what we do at the beginning of the year to advocate for those additional transportation funds. It looks like there may be some interest in the legislature on taking action before the next budget year, because the high-speed rail project has said that they need funding before next fiscal year. So we will keep you posted on that front. And then finally, just wanted to touch on a couple of other programs. There is a Community Economic Resilience Fund that was part of SB 162. Again, this bill was not signed yet at the time of the writing of the staff item, but it has now been signed. And that bill makes refinements to the Community Economic Resilience Fund, or SURF program. And it is $600 million towards building more robust, sustainable, equitable recovery from COVID across all sectors of California's economy. Attachment B has more detail on that program. And I just wanted to call out a couple things from that. The state agencies that are running it are going to be dividing the state into 10 to 13 economic regions, which may not be the same as the MPO regions. In some cases, they won't be. Not sure I don't know how much the north part of the state will change. I think the Southern California Association of Governments would be divided up differently, but we don't know yet. And they will be looking for one application from each region. So we're already working with a prosperity partnership to ensure our region is ready to compete collectively for these funds. And James, I don't know if you want to expand on any of that at this time or not, but no.
No, just you've done a nice job. So I'm getting a lot of feedback. So all good.
Thank you. And then finally, just broadband, there are some huge investments for middle mile and last mile broadband expansion. It's $6 billion over 3 years for broadband. And we know this is a topic of interest to many of our members. So we just wanted to highlight that. And attachment C has more details on that specifically. So with that, I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you, Sabrina. Any questions, comments? I will say it was it was surprising to see that the governor, and it was mostly the assembly, not come to an agreement on the high-speed rail funds and that money reverting. So the game of chicken, nobody won because the money just reverted back. So to be continued next year. And there's some other oddities within that discussion, but it was mostly a game of chicken between the speaker and the governor on those. Any questions? I did have on the broad, do we have a sense on the broadband dollars? And we'll bring this back, at least from the city of Placerville, back to the entire board to you. I know we gave during our full board meeting sort of our looking at having our own utility, if you will, for broadband, where we would sort of control that and have the companies come in, and we're going to have a new update on that next month, which moving us closer in that direction, and whether we're going to use any of our ARPA funds to sort of pre-invest into that to maybe set ourselves up for more competitively when it comes to these state funds. But I don't know from the last I had heard in the last days of session, or when they were doing this, was that there was this big pot, but there really wasn't much infrastructure, if you will, behind it to how they were going to allocate those broadband dollars.
Yeah, I don't know, Eric, if you have any more information from Valley Vision, but I don't know that there's a lot there yet in terms of further guidelines.
No, but Mr. Chair, we did talk to Valley Vision about potentially coming back and having that as an update item at your November committee. So if the timing's right for that, still we'll put that on the agenda for next month.
That'd be great. I do think there's lots of opportunities there for our region, for our individual cities that we can capitalize on, because if it is sort of, not a lot of guidelines yet, I think those up front are going to really benefit from that as they try to push these funds out. Okay. I don't see any other questions. Do we have any public comments?
No public comment.
Okay. Well, again, Sabrina, thank you for the update. And we'll see where this goes next. We do have, so there's 6 days left for the governor to sign bills. The October 10th is the last day. So we got a few more days here. Staff will be feverishly working, or are feverishly working to get through the rest of the bills that are on the governor's desk. Okay, let's go ahead and move to item 7. And this is a follow-up on AB 1401. This was a bill we had discussed at SACOG that we ultimately ended up tabling as an action item for a support that we ended up tabling. We had talked about bringing this back to see what we could do locally when it came to parking for parking spaces, and if we could tweak that, or at least maybe come up with some model language. So with that, I will turn it over to Dov.
Great, thank you, Chair, and good morning. As mentioned, this is an information item following up on that discussion we had in this committee, as well as with the board on AB 1401. Again, that was that bill that removed parking requirements near transit. As a very quick reminder, SACOG has identified reducing or removing parking requirements as a policy local, or a priority local policy change in several of our toolkits, as well as a few initiatives. Mind the Gap was one, housing policy toolkit, as well as the commercial corridors policymakers toolkit. We talked about some of the reasons why already, but just simply put, owners' parking requirements, they make housing less affordable. They reduce how many units you can fit on a parcel, and just generally are a one-size-fits-all approach that act as a barrier to producing more infill multifamily housing where we need it the most. At the August board meeting, many board members expressed some support for the underlying policy change of reducing or removing parking requirements, but again, some concern that the legislation was preempting local control. And so the board elected to table that item, but did express some interest in following up to explore the possibility of parking reform more at the local level. Local governments do have the ability to reduce or remove parking requirements at their discretion, but we have not seen significant reforms in our region on this issue yet. In the last 3 years, SACOG and the state of California have provided over $16 million of non-competitive grant funding to local governments, specifically to our region. for housing elements, but also for standalone housing policy changes that really try to accelerate the production of housing. Parking reform and reducing parking requirements was highlighted as a priority policy area, both at the state and the regional level. However, only 6 local governments included programs in their recently adopted housing elements to actually explore changes to parking requirements. You can see on the map here the relative spectrum of how many parking spaces are required for your typical 2-bedroom apartment complex in each jurisdiction. 17 of the 28 SACOG jurisdictions require 2 or more parking spaces per unit, which is quite high. And we think this is an issue that can really move the needle on MTPSCS implementation, connecting to our future work on Green Means Go and green zones, and really on just housing more generally. So again, given the interest expressed at this committee and at the board, we'd like to just hear from you on how SACOG can help you and help your staff to pursue reductions in parking requirements at the local level.
Great. Thank you, Dov. And James, I don't know if you wanted to make any comments on the top here before we go to comments or questions from board members.
Dov did a great job setting this up. I just think, and if you saw my update that just came out this morning, we do think this is a very big deal. It actually relates, I think, to Green Means Go and green zones. In other words, even within your jurisdictions, you don't necessarily have to have a one-size-fits-all. You could choose to have more flexible or to eliminate entirely parking requirements around these kind of green zones, infill areas, and let the market decide. We're not saying to not have parking there. We're really saying let the developer look at this, look at those sites and figure out exactly what's needed. It's very cumbersome when you've got to figure out how to make stuff pencil. And it's just yet another reason why I think a lot of our for-profit and nonprofit housing providers might not be looking at some of our older areas, more infill areas, older suburban areas. So yeah, we really wanted to put the finer point on this and bring it back for discussion.
Thank you, James. And so I'll open the floor for any comments here. Not seeing any.
Hey, Michael, Mike Kozlowski here.
Yep.
So I was one of the people that was not keen on the state legislation, but in Folsom we have made our parking requirement pretty flexible, and it is an intersection of being pro-business and libertarian while also supporting local transit development. So, there's no, as I said, when we talked about the state bill, I don't want to give up local control, but the policy direction was a good one, right? So we've done that in Folsom without any measurable negative consequence. It makes it possible for certain types of projects to pencil out if you don't have to devote so much space to parking spaces. It helps with redevelopment of commercial properties if you are flexible on those. But there still are instances where we have to demand that owners, provide parking because the city providing it for free, for instance, in our Sutter Street, historic downtown, is tremendously expensive, right? And those were historically not places that provided parking. So my pushback was about, the local jurisdiction should be able to be the one to control this situation, but nobody should be afraid of reducing their parking or making it more flexible to allow for fewer parking spaces. There's good reasons to do that. The world is generally overparked. We're prepared on our commercial properties for Christmas Day, when the reality is that 25% of that's necessary on a regular day. So anyhow, that's all. Thank you.
Oh, good points, Mike. And I'm glad you volunteered, because I was going to pick on you anyway, since you're one of the few cities actually in this committee, and I think Portia as well, that actually would have been affected directly by the bills, as opposed to some of us that were outside of the scope, but maybe believed in the premise of it. So I think those are good comments to hear for folks. And I think the question here really is, how do we, is it, as we look at this again, is there model language or something that we could do as a region? Or is it just because, we're all so different that we have to look at each one of these projects, a little bit differently? Certainly I can understand like Sutter Street, where you have an area where you just don't have the capacity otherwise. And so the city ends up bearing the cost of that lack of parking, versus in an area where, that's just not, you have other, whether it's off street or you just don't have the need for as many parking spaces. I mean, I get in some of my areas where it just doesn't make sense to me, or we're having someone, cut into a hill or do some major topography changes in order to fulfill requirements, especially when we're trying to build affordable housing, and why, it just doesn't pencil out when you start doing that. So, there are, I think, a lot of areas where we could do that. And I'll be the naive one here and say, for a long time, I thought we were bound by certain requirements in order to do parking. When I first was on city council, I never really thought about, we could make some of those changes, even at the local level, for ourselves. And so we're going to be, taking a look at that in the city of Placerville. But again, I'll open the floor to see any other comments from anyone else. And I guess where we move next is, I guess, the bigger question. If we want to move next as a body, to maybe look at something where we could develop it together.
Yeah, Michael, just to follow up on that, our situation in Folsom is a little unique because of the fact that we have a transit station right in Sutter Street area. So the way the bill was worded would have put some strange requirements on us, given that we had been pretty liberal about how to revise those parking requirements generally. But we have to your point about, how do you go from here to there? We have some entrenched business interests in the historic district and residential interests in the historic district. And then we have an entirely different situation if you just go a half a mile from where the train turntable is. It's an entirely different situation. So that was why I was arguing for, us maintaining local control. But as soon as you get outside of those, sort of super specific, unusual situations, you can easily almost completely throw out the requirement on commercial properties and leave it to the commercial entity to figure out if they can serve their customers with whatever number of parking spots they think they can provide. And I think the same goes for multifamily. If somebody is willing to develop a multifamily project, which clearly, based on all the discussions we've had over the last 3 years at SACOG, we desperately need in the region. If they think they can make a go of it where there's only a single parking space per unit, I say let them. It's let the market drive the decision more than some arbitrary choice of 1.5 or 1.75 or 2 or whatever per unit. So I'll shut up now.
No, thank you, Mike. Tom.
I'm just going to say, I'm not really up to speed on exactly what our parking requirement says in Woodland, but I know that every project comes along, I think we show flexibility. Staff has some discretion and they exercise it. I just finished 7 apartments. I have no parking spaces for any of them. It's right on a corner in downtown. And we have another area 2 blocks away where the developer built those 3-story individuals for sale units with a single car garage downstairs, no other parking spaces. So I feel like I really agree with Mike. I've never been a fan of one size fits all, and I think sometimes we end up with a lot of absurd results sometime when we are subject to requirements like that. So I really do feel if you have discretion, use it, and we've been using it. But that doesn't mean you should ignore it altogether. If your city continues to put this big requirement on people, it adds cost, and it may be totally adverse to the interests of transit use.
Thank you, Tom. Any other comments? All right. So, yes, Director Middleton.
Thank you. With Citrus Heights, we are in a very unique position because we are, 99%, built out. We have very limited space. So when it comes to infill, we really do need that flexibility, and that language is important, at least to me, in trying to figure out what's going to work. How do we develop that? Because, there's discretion and then there's what actually works. And if you're leaving it to local council members who may not be as interested in transportation as I am, or some of us are here, it makes it difficult to figure out what works in theory and what actually works in practice, right? So I think some support around that is critical.
Thank you, Portia. Okay, so I guess I'll toss over here to James for a second for his final thoughts. My thoughts here is a little bit of homework for us to Portia's statement. There is, there's going to be times where we can figure this out on our own. There may be times where, it'd be great to have potentially some model language or something to look at, so that when you do have maybe, whether it's staffing or council members that just don't have as much interest, whatever it might be, but that there be maybe a toolkit there if you're trying to move towards a less restrictive type of parking requirements, and kind of let the market dictate that. So, for folks to think about that, or, in cases, like Folsom or others that maybe really have some good ideas already, to maybe bring that back, whether it's to this to this committee, or whether we share it to the bigger to the full board. But with that, I'll go ahead and see if James, you have any other words of wisdom for us as we close this item.
Thank you, Chair. I do think we are flagging this issue for you, and we appreciated the debate on AB 1401. We are all very glad that we brought it to this committee and then onto the full board for that debate, because clearly there's a lot of interest in what you can do locally, what you have under your local control. But I think what you heard from staff and from Dov earlier is, and certainly there's a few jurisdictions that have done, been more flexible and lowered minimums. We think there's a lot more you could do. I mean, we think of parking as a tax on housing, and so how we can provide you the information, whether it's a workshop, whether we come back to this committee. I mean, I frankly think in green means go, right? I think remember, we've got now 23 to 24 jurisdictions around the region of the 28 that have identified green zones for the state funding. But the green means go part, if you remember, the idea was, if something has environmental benefit, let's do it. let's not wait around. Let's actually implement. And we were making the argument for state funding. And saying to the state of California, when we got that 38 million for Green Means Go, look, we don't have this kind of money for infrastructure. We don't have enough of it. Our local match is policy change. The things that you all can do that you want to keep in your control are things like parking minimums, right? So I just want to close this out, and I want to give Dov another word here. It looks like maybe Director Stalin has something to say, by saying, we think this is a very big deal. We worry greatly that how do we get infill product to market? How do we get more developers interested in this? This is one of the things that is suppressing the interest, because they look down that it's a long list, as you all have articulated, but this piece is in there. And so we really want to encourage, all of you, I think, perhaps through Green Means Go, to really take a second look at what's on your books and to figure out what are some, not one size fits all, but what are some really good sort of best practices model language that you could take back, we can work with your staff on, that really does roll out the red carpet for infill housing and affordable, that doesn't have to be overparked.
Director Stollard.
Yeah, before Dov gets his last word, when we redid our housing element, I mean, I don't know what kind of conversations, James, you and the team are having staff to staff with our people, but I don't remember anybody even thinking about running our housing element, by SACOG staff for comment or input. I would welcome you're looking at our parking requirements and offering suggestions. Whether we adopt them or not, it's our business. But frankly, we didn't have the benefit of your input at all when we did our housing element. And I'm sort of wondering if maybe there's a little disconnect there that we ought to all be, we're all looking for best practices, of course, but we also have uniquenesses, as Portia indicated, and basically as Mike has been saying. And so we have to take your advice with the recognition that it may not all completely work for us. But nevertheless, I think having that input and advice would be a great thing. And I welcome it. Take a look at our housing element now. And please tell me what you think could be better, certainly on the parking side. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Dov, any last words?
Sure. I'll just mention, so yeah, we certainly do work with all of your staff to the extent possible. Of course, it's sometimes difficult to track, 28 different housing elements at the 10 different stages, but we certainly have conversations with all of your staff as much as we can and offer our insight when appropriate. And certainly the toolkits are, an attempt to efficiently do that, right? We work with all of your staff and talk about all of the best practices that we have seen through sort of our expertise, but also working with, our stakeholders and developers and all the different folks that we know are actually building the housing. I will say, just for what it's worth, Director Stollard in Woodland, the parking requirement for a 2-bedroom apartment is 1.5 spaces, and then there's a guest space for every 5 units, so it ends up coming out to about 1.7. Those numbers, right, are often the way that we set things up in zoning codes is sort of like, here's the code, and then when a project comes through in a very discretionary manner, we sort of will negotiate some of the details on a project by project basis. What we've been suggesting and encouraging is to sort of set the standards up front of the types of products that you want to see, right? Send the signal to the market that we actually are looking to be flexible on parking and reduce that even further. The one thing I just want to add to that, James mentioned, of course, it's about promoting outcomes, but one other sort of carrot here, we've mentioned before the pro-housing designation that the state is putting together, where you get extra points in grant applications when you have a series of policy moves that are sort of seeking to accelerate housing production and are sort of best practices. The best practice where you get points on parking in the pro-housing designation is to reduce parking requirements below 1.5 spaces per unit. So that's an important threshold for being competitive in state grants. So the extent to which, certainly the best practice that we encourage is 0, removing parking requirements entirely. But if you are going to preserve them, the best practice is below 1.5 per unit. Thank you.
Thank you, Dov. And James, I think you brought this up in terms of, a workshop. I think that could be very beneficial. I'm not trying to add to already, a lot of work that you all have, but if you think that could be fit in somewhere, whether it's in this committee or to I think it'd be beneficial to the entire board, since we've had that initial discussion, but to bring some best practices forward and to really start, so it crystallizes a little bit more, I think, to what Dov said, so that we're thinking about it on the front end as opposed to just as we sort of negotiate on a project by project basis. Not that we wouldn't stop doing that, but that we would send that signal. So if that's a possibility, I think that would be at least an option for us to look at as we move forward on this issue. All right. Any last comments from anybody?
You could help encourage the market to decide what a parking space is worth to a homeowner by making developers sell them separately. If it's an upgrade to your sale price, people will make hard decisions about how many cars they want to have.
It's true. As long as they're not on the lawn. No, you're right, Mike. I mean, it would be like anything else. You want the granite or the basic, or you want that second driveway or whatever it might be. It's a good point. All right. Well, thank you everybody for the discussion. More to come here. But we'll go ahead and move on with the rest of our agenda. and move to our last item, which is item 8, and that's the 2024 MTP SCS update. And Binu has this for us this morning. Thank you.
Good morning. Yes, my name is Binu Abraham, and I'm the project manager for the 2024 MTP SCS update. Give me 1 second while I share my screen. Okay, I'm hoping you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. All right, so last month we had the kickoff of the MTP SCS, and we gave an overview of what the process is going to be. And we told you at that time that we'll be coming in the coming months with more information as to how the process will be done, what's the work schedule, what are the elements involved in it. So in this month, I'm going to attempt to explain our work schedule and what our process map is going to look like in the following, well, about 2.5 years. So just to recap, MTP SCS is a long-range plan that combines land use strategies with transportation investments to meet the varying travel needs of the residents in the SACOG region. So it's basically a federally and state-required policy document for long-range planning. It marries the local land use development with the transportation project to build a better connected community. In addition to providing a multimodal transportation system, it also provides a path for improving our air quality while preserving our open space and natural resources, and it is also a financially constrained plan. Again, this is another slide that you have seen many times, so I won't put a lot of time and effort into it, but I just wanted to bring you the information that all the work that we do in the plan development falls under one of these 5 categories, whether it is the economic forecast or the growth forecast, whether it is a land use development or our transportation investments, and then checking our performance outcome of what we have planned for in our plan, and then developing our policies and strategies, and at the last, the board adopting the plan. So the work over the next 2.5 years is basically dictated by these 5 elements of our plan. So the staff has put together a process map that will outline the major work that's happening over the next 2.5 years. I know it's a lot of information, but I just wanted to, I promise to bring you segments of it as we evolve the work, but I just wanted to give you an overview, one for transparency, so that any stakeholder who is interested in being part of the whole process or part of a phase will know when to get involved and have more information. And secondly, this whole thing is very connected. We have divided the entire work into 7 phases, starting from now until the winter of 2024. We are hoping to adopt the plan in 2024 February. So there are 7 phases that is in there, and each phase culminates in a milestone component, which is critical for the work leading to the next phase. So it's very important for us to have a full understanding of what work is happening, but at the same time, focus on each phase so that the board will know what we are going to be achieving at the end of each phase. So there are 5 board actions. The pink squares or the rectangles denote where the board will be taking an action on this. So right now, I just want to focus on the first phase, which is happening between now and February of 2022, which is the winter of next winter. In this thing, there are a few different things that are happening, starting with the process map that I'm just showing you right now. So one of the key elements of the work starts with defining the work schedule and having a process map. So that is something that the work staff is, this is a draft, and in the next coming months, we will be fine tuning it and bringing it to you by the end of phase 1 for adoption. The second factor is the framework. Every 4 years, we get a chance to revisit the focus areas based on the changing needs of the region. So for example, in the last plan, the framework was the economic prosperity. So in November or next month, we will be bringing you recommendation on topics and policy areas that are of local and regional significance that should be explored more in more detail. So that would be our information item for November. And in December, there is no committee, but we will be bringing you a growth forecast, which is shown in the blue line, squiggly line at the bottom. We will be having a board workshop that shows our growth forecast, which is basically the projections that we set to population, employment, and household totals for the plan horizon year. And it's based on the long-term growth trends, demographics, and economic data. So currently staff is working on that. And by December, we will be bringing you that item. The following month, in January, the staff will propose an engagement strategy for board to consider to guide the stakeholder, partner, and public outreach of the plan. So these are some of the elements that we will be bringing you over the next few months, which will culminate in a board action of the policy framework in February. You will notice that I kind of skipped over the local agency review portion. And that is because my colleague, Sam Stelton, in like few minutes is going to go over that in detail. So I'm just going to just not talk about it right now. So just to recap, end of phase 1 will be February 2022. And at that time, we will be bringing you a bundle for the board action, which will be the policy framework. The policy framework is a statement of major policy issues, challenges, and priorities the SACOG board has identified as priorities to be addressed in the region's long-range transportation plan. This framework will act as an overarching guide for all the planning work that follows until the plan adoption. So this bundle will be a total of our process map, of the growth forecast that we'll be bringing in December, of the engagement strategy that we will be bringing in January. So the 4 portions will constitute, once the board take an action on it, it will constitute the end of phase 1. So I'll pause here for a second and see if there are any questions before I hand it over to Sam. All right, seeing no questions, I will let Sam talk about the next portion, which is the project sponsor engagement.
Thanks, Manu. Go ahead and try to share my screen. Oh, I see someone is already sharing their screen. Thank you. Let's try using the MTP SES timeline slide for a second. I'd like to give you a sneak peek into one of our next steps, which is about building the transportation project list that is used for scenario development. And now I can share my screen. Nope, not yet. Someone else is still sharing their screen. There we go. Great. So that's the green circle in the middle as it goes toward land use, the transportation call for projects. So when we talk about sponsor engagement, we usually talk about staff meeting with project sponsors like planners and engineers from cities and counties We're reviewing spreadsheets of detailed project data, and we're collecting planning, documentation, and engineering diagrams. Well, with a plan that is updated once every 4 years, we typically need to help local staff and committee members understand how best to work with SACOG. So how can SACOG staff help make this easier? We drafted this FAQ that includes questions from past cycle development and a handful of process updates for this cycle. So maybe this is your first plan cycle and you don't remember everything, or maybe you don't remember everything from 4 years ago. We've got some general questions to help bring you up to speed. For local staff who need more details, we also have sponsor-specific questions in that section. But not all jurisdictions have staff that can spend hours reviewing spreadsheets and helping SACOG compile project data. How can we improve this? How can we streamline the process to help reduce the burden on planners and engineers? Historically, we've requested a similar level of project descriptions and accuracy and precision, more in line with nearer term funded projects with a lot more detail. So project concepts that are closer to the plan horizon year, like 2040 or 2050, they're going to need a lot less information. So we're going to try to match the level of requests to the information that SACOG needs for analysis. When we get closer to those sponsor engagement steps next spring, such as developing interactive mapping tools like the slide that you see here, we'll also be using the policy framework after it's been adopted to match those tools based on what we're trying to achieve with plan development. I'd be happy to answer questions or perhaps entertain new FAQs you'd like to add to this list to help inform the process and help folks along.
Great. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Binyu. Any questions, comments? See none. Any public comments?
No public comment.
Okay. Well, again, thank you for the update. We're looking forward to the next step in the process and to be continued. It's almost like when you what's the whole, you paint the bridge on one side and then by the time you get to the end, you're back to painting the other side. So we're in that next process again. So again, thank you both, and to be continued. Okay, so with that, Eric or James, is there any other matters as we wrap up here?
Nothing from me.
James, any final comments?
Chair Saragosa, just that for the benefit of all the committee members here, the Strategic Planning Committee, which is SACOG's current leadership and former board chairs, will be meeting their final meeting of the year. There's 3 this year at 1 o'clock to begin to tackle the policy framework ideas on the MTP-SES. We have a great guest speaker, Sunny Wright McPeak, some of you know, and also talk a little bit about measuring our progress and our impact as an agency. So that's the beginning of a conversation with that group that the full board will hear more about. And then just a reminder too, although we've got a lot of RSVPs on this one because it's very timely, on Thursday at noon, you'll have your virtual lunch that we hope sometime soon we'll get back to an actual lunch with real food. But for now, we've got a great topic. Jim Piper from the Regional Water Authority will be here to talk about drought, climate resilience, and even Green Means Go in terms of the water sewer infrastructure projects that we're working with their agency on. So noon to 1 on Thursday will be a great lunch. And that's a wrap from me.
All right, thank you, James. Members, any final comments from anybody? All right, seeing none, well then everybody, I'll give you back 12 minutes here and hope everybody enjoys the rest of your week, and I'll see a couple of you here in a couple hours as well, or an hour. All right, bye everybody, thank you.
Bye.
Take care.